Hi there and welcome to this tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at drawing eyes. Now, eyes come in a lot of shapes and varieties, all different species have lots of different eye types. So I thought specifically we'll focus today on feline eyes. So I'll turn this probably into a tutorial series over time, focusing on, say, a species or a family of animals each class. But today we're going to do cat eyes. So let's get going. And what we're going to do is I'm going to start off by drawing the basic shape. So we're going to go over here and I'll fill this up with other examples later, but we'll start here. So I'll start off with a basic shape and I always kind of go with a circle because this will be our eyeball and we can build up things around the actual eyeball. And then we'll go through shading and turning it into a more 3D shape later. What we're going to do is start off with a very straightforward eye, and it'll be an eye that's looking directly at us. So starting with the circle, as you can see, that's pretty much going to be most of our eye. Cat eyes are really, really round, so it's super easy to build up around this eyeball shape. So pretty much all eyes start this way, no matter what the species that we draw. All eyes will start with a nice big circle, which will be the basis, which will build, which will build up on afterwards. So once I have a structure down, I'm going to draw in the pupil. I've got a reference. I think that's really handy for anybody who's learning to draw anything. So make sure you've got a reference if you're very new to it. So I'm going to look at my reference, and the cat eye pupil in this one is quite narrow. So I'm just going to pop in a very narrow pupil. We'll build up on this afterwards, but that's what I'm going to start off with. So next I will build up the eyelids. Looking at this cat eye, the lower lid kind of comes in at this angle. Remember, when you've got the pupil, the lids fit in around the eye, so you'll tend to find that they're very curved around the actual eye themselves. So I'll bring in this lower lid here. I've kind of got the third eyelid here, which I'm just going to draw in. So this is where the tear duct is as well. This is that corner of the eye here. The tear duct is going to be down here. This is when you're looking at it, this is the right hand eye. So this is the left hand, right, left, whichever one. This is the cat's right hand eye. The next eyelid kind of goes in over the top, so I'm going to do this big old curve up here like this as well. I'm trying to make this nice and light and sketchy. I'm using a black pencil because I know graphite has a problem sometimes on the camera, so we're just going to go with this today. Keeping it nice and loose and sketchy. I can always build up on over the top of this later anyway. So I think this pupil's a bit big, so what I'm going to do, just for learning purposes, I'm going to slightly erase it and bring in that pupil again. So even though I've kind of drawn the eyelids very close to the original circle, really the eye itself is going to be much bigger than what we see. The eye is a very big organ, and what we see via the actual eye of the cat is a much smaller version. We don't see the full eyeball because otherwise the eyeball would be, it would fall out, which is not good. So we've kind of got a basic structure here. I've built it up around the sphere of the eye. So I'm keeping it fairly light at the minute. This pencil has the power to be basically solid black, but I'm going to keep it nice and light so that I can kind of, if I go, oh, that's too dark, I could just erase it and bring it in. So when I'm kind of happier with it, I think I'm going to just start building in the lines I want to stay. So I know that I like this lower lid. I'm just going to bring it in nice and heavy there. So this is only the really the waterline of the eye itself. The eyelid is obviously much thicker, which I can kind of do a little sketch in here. Just a few little hairlines to suggest that this is furry. Now, the eyelid line kind of goes off at this angle here. It's not like there's not eyelashes, this is just the fold of where the two lids meet. Now I'm going to do the same, the upper waterline. Bring it in nice and dark. And then this is that hidden third eyelid, pretty much. So I'm going to follow this waterline here. So whilst this is the actual lower lid, this is the kind of membrane that's in between the eye and the eyelids. And I'm just going to bring that in like that. So now I'll do this last little bit of the eyelid here. It's kind of a square end to it. It's not completely pointed, more curved. Bring that in here. And then this will kind of meet up here. And then this is where the lower lid goes down. And you always kind of get this kind of tear duct area, which I'm just going to block in, along with where the upper lid, or the fur above the upper lid falls. Just going to give it a little bit of a sketchiness to it. Keep it nice and light. We have the basic structure of what our eye is going to look like. I'm still not completely happy with this pupil, but that's fine because that's what the next stage is going to be for. I'm going to be building up over this anyway, and we can, you know, we don't have to erase it. We can just draw over the top of it. So with this structure in place, I'm now going to start shading it. I like to cross hatch, but that's just personal preference. But I'm also going to first block in the eye, the pupil. Yeah, I'm just going to move it ever so slightly over. Don't worry about the fact that this is still here. We can go over the top of this later. Obviously, if you want to erase it, feel free. That's absolutely fine. It's just my personal preference. I tend to just be lazy and not erase anything. Because so this eyelid, this eye that I'm looking at, has got a very narrow pupil, which suggests there's a lot of light perhaps where this cat is. You can also see, and I suggest looking at lots of references, there's this kind of, where the muscles fold together, there's this like little nook here. And it's the same at the bottom. So whilst the pupil looks like it's a slit, there's actually these two little areas where the muscles kind of unite, and it's not quite completely slit-like. So just remember, if you're drawing realism anyway, it doesn't matter if you're going to stylize it later, but I do recommend when you're learning something, just go for realism first and stylize later. That can always come later. You don't have to just dive in with making your version of it. So, we've got here the pupil. I tend to get the pupil in first, even though like the way that most people get taught is start with the lighter colours and build up. I know that the pupil's always going to be black, so I'm pretty much just going to stick with put all the dark areas in. It's just personal preference. I know this is going to stay the same. The shading isn't going to matter. At least then I know where the pupil is and I can build up around it. I'm going to focus on where I'm going to put the highlight. So I think I'm going to kind of stick with what the reference has got here and put the highlight in around about here. You can make it curve with the eyeball. It kind of gives us this 3D shape to the eye as well, which is really useful. I always kind of put a very, high contrast line. I always put a sharp line between the shading anyway, but this is just my style. Obviously, if you want to have a softer edge, you can just shade away from it, for example, like that. But I always block in where my highlights are going to be. So I'm also going to pop in the shadow. So I know this is going to be a highlight. I'm also going to pop in the main areas of the shadow. So with most eyes, based on lighting and everything, because the the eye is set back slightly, there's always going to be a shadow that goes along the top and around this edge. So I'm just going to pop that in. I'm just not going to shade anything. I'm just going to draw the line to show where the shadow is going to be. And it's normal for the highlight to kind of go over the top of the shadow as well, so don't be afraid if they intercept. So this I know is where the shadow is going to be. And looking at this this reference as well, there's a bit of a shadow that kind of goes here. There's like a semicircle here of shadow. So, and there's also this, rather conveniently, this has ended up working quite nicely, but there's a kind of a band of highlight that goes along the pupil, which shows that there's depth to the muscles that all work along here. The eyes themselves are made up of quite a lot of thin fibrous muscles, so I'm just going to kind of pop in a few of these. Obviously, because my style is quite loose, these will probably fade away anyway, but for now, to give you kind of an example, the muscles all kind of go from the center and it builds up like this. Just going to put them in really loosely and kind of make them curve slightly, because obviously the pupil, the eye itself is spherical, so make them curve ever so slightly, and it adds a bit of depth to this drawing. Now it's up to you how you go about this. I'm a bit weird and I like to put the shadow in first, like I said with the pupil. I know it's going to be dark. So I'm going to put this band of shade in first. I'm just going to stick with cross hatching because it's what I'm most comfortable with. And I'm going to just hatch in where this shadow is. Kind of going with the fibres ever so slightly, but it doesn't matter too much for me at this minute. So this is very loose. This isn't exactly how the shadow is going to look at the end, but this is kind of where the shade's going to be. And I'm looking now at the reference, and there's almost a darker patch here. So I'm just going to pop in a bit of shade. I might even start the shadow darker here and let it fade ever so slightly into the middle. It just gives that a bit of depth. So I'm just going to pop in these lines as well. This is where the muscles are, but sticking with the fact that this is darker here and this is lighter. So, just building it up. I'm also going to do the shadow here. Again, just cross-hatching because it's my favorite method of shading. So, try and decide whether I keep consistent with the, yeah, I think I'm going to carry on. I'm not going to go with the fibres of the eye, but I'm just going to add this shadow in here. It just gives this sense of depth to the eye itself. And then leave this highlight, even though the highlights aren't always white. But I'm going to leave it fairly white so it stands out a bit better. Just give this kind of extra depth. Add in a bit darker. I'm just keeping it kind of messy. Obviously this is just a brief tutorial on how to draw eyes. There's a bit of a shadow here, a bit darker. I might just go over it slightly, even though it's cross-hatched, just give it a very light addition to the shading. Cool. So I'm always referring back to the reference that I've got, just because it's good practice. So I'm just going to add in a bit more shadow, but ever so slightly lighter than this here. There's also, right under where the highlight is, there's another band of shade. So I'm just going to consistently just block in new areas and just shade. And we can go back over the top with detail later. So if I want to reinforce these muscle lines, I can do that later, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to blend in this line here. Cool. And now I'm going to just give the rest of the eye very light crosshatch, just to add a bit of shadow. So when you start adding the shade, it will start to come together, which is really nice. So I'm just going to pop in some of these fibers here. It kind of brings it all together. Go over this original shade. I don't like quite how strong that border of that highlight is, so I'm just going to blend it out. Quite easy, just blend it out. Lots of light layers, if you're doing shading, is better than one really heavy layer. It's just easier to rectify if you're doing lots of light layers. Check my reference. Again, so doing lots of kind of light shading, it gives you this sense that the eye it's got a lot of depth to it. I might just add in a bit more shading here because it seems a bit too flat for me at the minute. Just kind of blend out this original shadow because it is much darker here in my reference. But it doesn't mean, you know, I say stick to references when you're learning. It's a great way of learning. But obviously as your skill builds, you can kind of run with it a bit better yourself because you've got the muscle memory there. I'm going to throw in some more of these fibers. And a bit more depth here. There's lots of eyes are beautiful. They do have a lot of delicacies to them. So once I've got the shadow down, what I'm going to do is just kind of go over the top with a bit of extra detail. So there's a lot of muscle lines here. And the way I'm using my pencil here, so I'm kind of going thick to thin in one stroke. So I'm just lightly pressing and then applying the pressure ever so slightly more. And that over time, it gives you this kind of thick, thin, and that adds a real nice variety to the sketch itself. So thin, press, thin, press. And you can see it adds just this nice variety. And it's got the same here, so the muscles kind of go like this. And it's this ever so slight attention to detail that just, I think, makes it pop a little bit more. Obviously, this is mainly for realism, and it doesn't, I mean, it's not hyper realistic, it's not like a photograph, but it's still more realistic than I would say normally draw an eye. So when I've got this kind of main structure, I'm quite happy with it. But I'm going to go in and do the rest of the eye around the skin and fur around, just to add a bit more depth to it. Paying attention to where the lighting is on this eye itself, because eyes are pretty kind of glossy and wet. So I can see on my reference there's this band of shine, which I'm just going to leave blank. I might even go in with my eraser here and just bring it out so you can see where the glossiness is. And there's also a bit of shine here, which I'm just going to block out. And the rest I know is pretty dark, so I'm just going to go in and apply the black pencil. Go back and I'm not extremely attentive to the sharpness of my pencil. I probably should be, but I find it does what I need it to do as is. Cool. So this is very thin band of light here, right in the corner. Just paying attention to what my reference is showing me. And at the minute trying to be as accurate as possible because it's all about learning right now. Cool, so you kind of got where the shine is. Now I'm just going to bring in some darkness, but not a full blackness, where the lower lid is. And kind of, I might actually better off paying attention to where the fur lies. So it gives the sense that there is fur here, but I'm not going to be extremely detailed and draw every single fibre, every single hair. Just kind of give this impression that it's furry by adding the sketch in a certain way. You can always emphasize the fact that it's furry by throwing in a few extra lines here. Excellent. So we'll do the same here with this tear duct area. Give a darker shadow and just lightly sketch it in. So I'm not even paying attention much to the shading too drastically here. I'm just throwing in a bit of extra shadow for the sake of this tutorial. Also going to go in and do the top line. So being conscious of where the fur lies. Give a sense of the eyelashes as well. Most of the stuff that I've learned and will teach through the course of my tutorials are going to be things that I've learned and practiced myself. So I encourage everyone learning to kind of develop their own techniques. Here's the things that work for me, but feel free to play with them. You don't have to do them exactly how I do them. Bring in a bit of extra shadow here. There's actually a very, very dark line that goes right underneath the eyelid, so I think I'm going to emphasize that as well. Pressing very hard with my pencil now. But there, you see all the smudges from my pencil. Oops. But yeah, so that's how you kind of focus on drawing a cat eye. Start off with a circle to give you this idea of where the curves are going to be of the skin folds. Paying attention to the lower waterline, where the pupil is. Definitely use references if you're just getting started on something. It definitely helps when you're learning how to shade stuff as well, so something to bear in mind. Cool, so we've got our cat eye. I'm just kind of going in, scribbling over the top, adding a bit of extra detail. I'm not being super precise because it's just a sketch. So that's your very basic cat eye. Straight at the camera, pretty simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a different version of the eye from maybe a different angle, because you can apply the same kind of techniques to different angles of the eye as well. Just going to look for a new reference. Had a very good one. There we go. Right, I've got this really nice one here. Cool. So this eye is going to be kind of a side profile eye. So we're going to start off again with the circle. So that's where the eye is going to be, but it's actually going to be looking that way. Instead of straight on, it's going to be looking that way. So you can always use a circle as a basis for an eye. This one, this is the front of the eye here, because you've got the classic dome of the eye. What I'm going to do, I'm actually going to build in the upper brow or the upper eyelid, just following my reference. So that's where the upper lid kind of comes in. And then you've got the corner of the eye here. And this is where it looks like it should be the lower eyelid, but because of the way that this photo is taken, this is actually more like the cheekbone. So I'm just going to bring that down. I'll bring that into there. And now, based on the fact that we've got our cheekbone in, we can actually look at where the eyelids fall. This is where the upper eyelid hits the eye itself. But the upper lash line kind of comes out like this. It looks very basic right now, but that's all it needs to be, is basic. Trust the process when you're sketching. It's going to look ugly for a while until you get around to finishing it, so don't worry. It's a few extra lashes, so I'm just going to sketch those in here. And then we have the lower lash line. So it kind of goes like that. And then the tear duct goes along here. Very simple. Now, the eye itself is really interesting. So it has this big old curve here of what is essentially clear. And it kind of, it's an interesting one to draw because this is see-through, but not see-through because obviously it's got the colour of the fur or the colour of the eye reflected in it, refracted in it. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to sketch in this area of which is basically reflected light. Is clear at the minute. Now the pupil itself, when it's straight on, is pretty much straight, but when you're looking at the eye from a side profile, the pupil falls back to a little bit more along this line here. And then you've got one line which is kind of straight, and then this one is much more curved because of the way that the eye falls. So this is kind of straight and this is kind of curved here. I'm also going to pop in some highlight. So I'm going to put the highlight in here. But I'm just this is obviously much more kind of aimed at anybody looking at the reference. So make sure you're following your reference if you're learning how to draw this. But this is where the muscle of the actual iris is. The rest of this area is more of the clear area of the eye, which is all reflected light. I'm just going to bring that up a bit because actually, looking at my reference, this area is much lighter than this kind of area here. So I'm going to start applying my shade. I'm going to pop in the pupil, but I think this highlight kind of goes slightly over the pupil, so I'm not going to colour the whole thing. I'm just going to colour where I know there's pupil. A little curve here. So I'm constantly looking at my reference. This is where my pupil is. When you're doing side on, it definitely helps to have a reference, especially if you're new to it, because you can see how it really affects the shape of everything based on the eye is a sphere, and the way that the dome of the I can't remember the actual anatomy, I can't remember what it's called, but the clear area of the eye changes the kind of shape of everything based on the way that light passes through it. Kind of have here the edge of the eye, so that's where the iris is, and there's a bit of white here, so I'm just going to leave that clear for now. So now I'm going to start adding the shade. I'm going to focus on this shadowy area here first. Paying attention to the fact that it's not completely smooth. There is kind of a roughness of where the muscle falls. Add a bit of shadow. Giving a very soft shading here up against the line. I'll leave this front bit completely white because it's basically reflected light. So I'm going to bring that down here like that. Oh, next bit of shadow I'm going to put in is probably this top bit from where the upper eyelid casts a bit of a shadow. Like this. Ever so slightly bring in that shade here. And with this cat's eye, he's got that same light area here that goes along the front of the pupil. So I'm just going to sketch that in here. And then there's also the shadow here, but is more It's thinner because of the way that the light is working. Throw in my shadow here. And then there's a bit more shadow here. Ever so slightly creeps out like that. And I'm going to throw in the highlights, throw in the lighter shading for the rest of the eye, because there's not much detail on this exact reference I've got. But I can play with it a bit. So there's a bit of the muscles kind of going like this. Just keeping it nice and sketchy. A few muscles coming in like that. A darker line here where the iris ends. Creeps onto the white of the eye there. So now I can add in, I'm quite happy with that, I can add in the upper lid line. This kind of darker area here that creeps down here. That. And then throw in the shading down here. Paying attention to the reference. And just kind of going, oh, there's some eyelashes here, or rather furry area here. And I might just sketch in a few extra lines to suggest the furriness. This is where the cheek is. I'm just going to sketch in some area here. So you basically apply the same techniques to the frontways eyes as you do to the sideways eyes. You've put in a nice circle sphere to show where the eye is. So the eye itself is probably more like that shape. Probably takes up a lot of the head, but only the front part is really visible. Cool. So those are kind of your regular old house cat eyes. Now I'm going to do one more, but it's going to be a large cat's eye. So we have obviously lions and tigers. The interesting thing about the difference between a house cat eye and a large cat eye is that large cats or big cats, such as lions and tigers and other large species, have always got a round pupil. Now, house cats, they can go from slits to basically full-blown black eyes when they're hunting. But large cats always have a circular pupil. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a large cat eye now. And then I'm going to do some like very simple doodles of different versions of eyes with different shapes of eyelids so that you can kind of learn how to take fine detail or take highly detailed practice studies into more stylized versions of the eye. So we're going to start off with our lion eye here. Again, we're going to do a big old circle. So this is the whole eyeball. Again, we're going to have a frontways facing eye because you get to see the pupil a bit better. But actually, only about this much of the eye is seen. It might even be less than that. So we have, this is where the eyeball is itself. This is how much of the iris is seen. So I'm just going to draw in the basic shape of my lion eye. There's a very long kind of lash line of where the eyelids meet. Come down here into this lovely point here. But only this much of the eye is actually visible. So I'm just going to sketch in where the eye is, or the visible part of the eye is. The pupil is about here for this reference photo that I've got. And then we'll have the dark patch of where this is the actual eye bit, and then you've got the lash line or the water line that goes down ever so slightly here. But we'll focus on that, I'll worry about that in a minute. This is where the third eye is. Cool. So again, I'm just gonna throw in the pupil so I know where it's looking. Always circular, no matter how big the pupil gets, how narrow the pupil gets. For large cats, it's always circular. I throw in where my highlight goes, so it kind of creeps over there, and there's a little bit here as well. Now I'm going to pop in where the shadow is. The wonderful thing is about this eye that I've got here is the shadow is quite large, and the shadow creeps in to that kind of area. There's also a band of shadow along the bottom. I'm just going to throw in some of these really interesting lines so I know where the shadow is. There's also a bit of shadow along here where the pupil is. So I'm going to pop the shadow in first because I think the shadow is really interesting on very round eyes. So I'm just going to sketch in. The lighting is falling very nice on this eye that I've got here. Now there's shadow that comes out like this. So this area is ever so slightly darker, and I'm going to go with the muscle fibres here because it looks nice on this eye. Oh, and then there's also shadow that kind of goes along the top. Paying attention to where I've left the highlights, don't have to shade those in. And I'm just going to add in a bit more shadow actually because I think it's slightly darker here. Kind of going in a ever so slightly circular motion. There. Cool. That's where the shade is, and now I'm gonna throw in the lighter part of the eye here as well. So you've kind of got this dark bit that goes underneath with this where the muscle is. There's also these interesting muscles that kind of go around like this. Scribble those in as well. Reinforce that shadow. And there you have the actual eye itself. Very, very circular. I'm going to throw in the waterline here. And then paying attention to where the fur ends. I'm going to put those in there. Top layer of fur. Strong black line here where the eye meets the eyelid. And then you got this upper lid kind of goes along here. Like this. That's where the lower lid kind of falls in. I'll leave an ever so slightly lighter area for where the kind of waterline is itself. So you kind of got an area of reflection or shininess. I'm just going to colour in. This is where the tear duct is. And then the rest of this is kind of darkened skin around the eye. So don't be afraid to just play with it and throw in the shading how you want it to go. Cool. Obviously you've got the markings that go around the eye here. Just sketch those in. Cool, so that's the difference between your regular house cat and your large cat, is that the large cat always has circular pupils, whereas the house cat, and interestingly foxes as well, get the same eye type, but they can go from basically full black eyes to little narrow slits depending on lighting, depending on what they're hunting. So that's just worth bearing in mind. If you're ever drawing a lion and you've drawn this kind of eye and you're wondering why it looks a bit odd, it's likely because, well, lions have circular eyes, circular pupils instead. So those are more realistic eyes. What I'm going to do is just going to throw in a few examples of what you can do to really play around with the eyes themselves. So always I'm going to start off with the sphere. So I'm going to go with doing two eyes here, with a cat looking a bit more playfully. So I've pop in where I want the kind of eyes to be. I'm going to throw in the upper lid line, the lower lid line, taking into account this reference I got here. Obviously it's much more stylized, it doesn't have to be exactly accurate this time. So the lower lid's going to be, I'm just going to draw that so I've got an idea of where they fall. So I'm going to do a cat that's kind of playful. So he's got his big old dark pupils up. Because obviously the pupils are taking up so much space, it's likely that the highlights are going to go over the top. We're just going to go here with my highlights. I'm going to pop in a darker version. This is where the upper lash line is. Obviously I'm stylizing it now because it's not a realistic study. So I'm just gonna play with it. Maybe go in with the little kind of eyelash skin fold there. Bring that down here. Let's say we go in with the big old pupil. The stereotypical Puss in Boots size. So cute and mischievous. Do the same here. Trying to match it as best as I can. See if I'm drawing two eyes together. I want it to look symmetrical. But that always seems to be the case. The first eye will be fine, and then you try to draw the second one and it doesn't look as good. And then colour in that pupil here. Cute. It's a very simplified version, obviously, and you can pop in where the eyebrows are. But yeah, so you can play with it quite a lot by using the same techniques as what I just used. You can kind of simplify it. And say if you're looking down a bit, so you've got more of the upper lid, you can kind of close the eye ever so slightly, for example. Bringing in that upper lash line. Got the lower lash line. So you'll have that looking over slightly over here. So I'm always building up over the top of a sphere or circle. It just gives me a better idea of how to add depth, because you know, the eyes are spherical. You can just build up around that. Makes it easier. So this one kind of goes like this. These ones are much more doodly, obviously. I'm not trying to keep them very realistic. If you want to do a very simplified shading, I would kind of go like almost like that, add in, this is where the highlight's going to be and this is where the shade's going to be. Just block it out. There's always the kind of shadow at the top of the eye, maybe a bit at the bottom as well. I'd light a bit here. Cool. This one's kind of looking down ever so slightly. Cool. Much more simplified, but the shadows there, you can add a bit of detail in. Just really play with it and enjoy it. But yes, I always encourage starting with a sphere, a big old circle, because it just makes it much easier to build up around. Might do another at this kind of angle. So again, throw in a sphere. This is where the cheekbone is, where the upper lash line is. Keep it nice and gently curved. And tear duct. And cat's eyes come in loads of different colours as well, so if you're the kind of person that likes to colour the eyes, you can play with colour. They're so pretty. This one's got a nice bit of shading there, or highlight there rather. I'm going to keep the shadow simple, so I'm just going to throw in there. And the more you practice, the better you get at kind of doing it out of your own memory rather than straight off using a reference every time. Eyebrow. I have another pair of eyes here. Starting off with big old spheres. I'll do the upper lash. Do here the upper lash as well. The lower lash. Now we're folding that skin around this original sphere. Put in a pupil, maybe throw in a highlight. Shade the pupil. So yes, when you're learning, always stick to using a reference where you can. You can either use photos, you can go and, if you've got a cat, draw from them. That's a great version of a reference. It's actually drawing from a live animal is a great way of practicing. You get an idea for the depth of things then, much better than if you just draw from photos all the time. We keep these ones nice and simple. Bring that down here a little bit. Maybe a little bit of shadow. Tend to start dark at the top, lighter in the middle. So you can even just go like this, keep it like that. Bring the shadow down. Like that, for example. Keep it light at the bottom because that's where the light would come through and kind of reflect off the bottom of the eye. Obviously put a bit of shadow here if you want to. But yes, play with it. Have fun, enjoy creating cat's eyes. So there you go. That's your tutorial on how to draw cat's eyes. I hope that helps, and I can't wait to see your versions of cat's eyes. So do tag me, do let me know if you draw any. I can't wait to see them, so thank you.